guys, welcome Eurobike Frankfurt. I hope you're all having a great start to the morning. This is going to be the first of our live shows. We've got a couple more throughout the day. We're going to start with Dr. Tim Podlogar, which we've got now. Later on this afternoon we've got Chris Froome, and tomorrow we have Benji Neeson. So some exciting talks ahead. But if you want to learn a little bit more about nutrition, head over now, because we've got a good talk coming up. For anyone who's not familiar with us, who hasn't seen our podcast, we've been running a podcast for quite some time. So if you haven't seen that, head over to YouTube or your platform that you listen to podcasts on, search for Nduranz, and you can listen to that. We've had some great guests over the past couple of years, lots from different aspects of endurance sports, nutrition, physiology. So there's some great topics to listen to there. So, you know, when you get home, go and check that out. So for those, is that loud enough? So for those who are perhaps not familiar with the podcast already, I'm Alex. I'm the host, and my glamorous assistant and co-host is here, which is Dr. Tim Podlogar. He's a performance nutritionist, a physiologist, and I suppose a good friend.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the science, Tim's role within the performance nutrition industry, and then at the end there's going to be an opportunity to ask any questions that you have. So I suppose first of all, a little bit of an introduction. I'll let you do that, but what is your role certainly within performance nutrition, the work you've done within professional cycling? If you just give the listeners a little bit of a brief of the work that you do.
Well, I'm standing here on the stand of Nduranz, so I'm working in sports nutrition industry. But first and foremost, I'm a scientist, so working with the University of Exeter at the moment as a lecturer. So I've been carrying out doing sports nutrition studies for numerous years now. So that's my main job. And I've also been a nutritionist in one of the world tour teams for the last 3 years. Now I'm changed the teams, but have been involved with professional cycling for a number of years now. Also work with numerous clients, like amateurs. So kind of I'd like to say that I have a privilege to be able to work both in the industry, from the sports nutrition brand to the athletes, and actually do the research on it, and basically be involved in all the aspects of sports nutrition.
So just to start off, where did that come from? What got your interest in science? Were you involved in endurance sport? Was it a passion from a kid, or was it just a pathway that you ended upon?
Yeah, it was the latter. So I haven't been an endurance athlete myself. I only started being a cyclist during my undergrad studies, when I wanted to better understand physiology. And then I started cycling a lot to basically be able to test things on myself, and that's how I got into cycling. And eventually I started working with athletes, and the rest is the history.
But you're a pretty avid cyclist, right? Is that purely through just wanting to test some of these things on yourself, to understand from a practical application that some of the science is valid, or did you have a passion from a younger kid to be a professional cyclist or anything like that?
No, I'm a good cyclist because my nutrition is perfect. No, just kidding. It's not like that. I think it's just I just train a lot because I really want to understand what athletes are going through, and I feel like the only way to do it is basically try to at least become part of that movement. So I spend a lot of time indoors on the bike because I have a full-time job, so I can't ride as much outdoors as I would like to. But it's basically just to try and better understand and test everything on myself. So all the studies I do, I first do on myself, and then try to do it on others so that I can really understand what athletes are going through.
And before we move on to deep dive into some of the nutritional side of things, do you think that with the role that you play, in the academic world, the research that you do you think that that's an important part to go, okay, this is perhaps what the data or the numbers are seeing, let's go test this, let's see if this works in reality, and first port of call is going to be yourself on that. Do you think that really helps the work that you do there and the advice that you give as well? Yeah,
definitely, because sports nutrition is there are trends that are coming and going all the time. Over the last 10 years that I've been kind of involved in sports nutrition, I've heard and saw many things that just came and also went away. But when you're involved in science, you kind of are able to understand what actually the rationale for certain things are and what actually the evidence is saying. So you're not talking bullshit, but also you can feed back and go, okay, athletes are saying this, can we just actually, does this make sense from a scientific perspective? Is it something science is missing and we need to investigate it better? So it's kind of like a closed loop and all the time evolving. And I think it really helps to actually better understand what athletes need and also deliver to the athletes the most up-to-date knowledge actually.
Because I think that's important, and we'll get onto that a little bit later, but we are seeing different trends in the sports now. We're seeing super high carb consumption, and whether that's the reality of what we're doing from a physiological point of view is probably still yet to be determined, but we'll come back to that. But I think primarily you've done a lot of work around carbohydrates. I mean, people probably know you for your Haribo and other carbohydrate advocacies. What is misunderstood by not only amateur athletes, but also from the professionals around carbohydrates?
Well, that's kind of the problem we have with trends. At the moment, and Nduranz might hate me for saying this, but I think we are overprescribing carbohydrates during exercise, kind of focusing on something that doesn't have as much as an effect as compared to the nutrition of the bike. And I think we need to be really sensible in providing solid advice and sound advice to the athletes. We just without just trying to sell them more gels or more products. And I think and we'll probably touch that in a bit, what's basically the amount you should be having. And I see it very often now that athletes are trying to just rely on the nutrition on the bike and forgetting about the rest, whereas actually it's the whole picture that's really important. And I think that's kind of the biggest problem these days. And the second one is definitely let's try to focus on supplements rather than actually solving the main issue, which is the nutrition in general. So trying to focus on 1% and not caring about 99%, which is basically the carbohydrate intake or the composition of your diet.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots that go into it. What do you find with your experience of working with amateurs and professionals? What are some of the common myths or that you see people, I suppose, struggling or coming to you with?
So yeah, there are many of them. Some people are still afraid of carbohydrates, and we know carbohydrates are really, really important for performance. We need them. We need glycogen stores, and being afraid of carbohydrates is not the best thing. Then we have people saying yeah, but you need to have a lot of fat in the diet because fat is healthy. Well, there is not that much evidence that fat intake would aid adaptations and it would aid recovery. So I think focusing on carbs is the most important thing. There is misconception that you can train the gut to increase the absorption rates of carbohydrates during exercise and be able to, if you can tolerate 200 grams per hour, that you're actually using 200 grams per hour. That's just not the case. And things like that, I think, are probably the biggest misconceptions these days. So for amateurs, let's just give an example. You do a trainer road or a Zwift ride for 2 hours and you're having 120 grams per hour. Your power output is actually, on average 250 watts. Well, if you have 120 grams per hour, your dinner can't really be big anymore. So you're in the recovery. if you want to sustain energy balance, you can't have a lot of carbs, you can't replenish glycogen stores, and the carbohydrates during exercise are actually not going to be used during exercise because you need quite some time to basically get to the peak oxidation rates or peak utilization rates of ingested carbohydrates. So these kind of things are like, yeah, you really need a deep understanding of the nutrition to be able to like come up with a really good nutrition plan. But yeah, I think we are overemphasizing super high amounts during exercise.
And on the other side of things, I think certainly what I've seen as well is that people are a little bit worried about, utilizing fats as fuel, and having high fat oxidation rates is really important for, longer sustained endurance efforts. And therefore, there's the low carb side of things. There's the promotion of fat oxidation. Where do carbohydrates come into that, and does that impact the ability to oxidize fats, perform better?
So yeah, that's a really good question, and I like to make a comparison. So let's say you're an amateur athlete and you want to kind of become better at fat oxidation, increasing fat oxidation rates. Well, you just go to a low carbohydrate diet, and trust me, like your fat oxidation rates will go through the roof, but your performance will actually suffer. And if you compare a professional rider with yourself as an amateur, the biggest difference is not going to be ability to oxidize fats, it's going to be your maximum performance aerobic capacity. So let's say amateurs VO2 max would be 50, professional athletes VO2 max would be 85. So the total amount of kind of energy you can, the turnover during exercise in a professional athlete will be much higher. So I think that's what you need to train rather than increasing fat oxidation rates. And the fat oxidation rates will increase naturally just because mitochondria, so the organ in the body, small, let's say, energy factory in the muscle will just adapt to the whatever fuel it has. And professional athletes are not on a low carbohydrate diet, but their fat oxidation rates are much higher than amateurs just because their capacity to use the energy is so much higher. So in other words, you don't want to be training to increase fat oxidation rates, you want to increase your fitness level. How do you increase fitness level? By optimizing recovery. How do you do that? Well, you increase the carbohydrate intake during and before exercise to be able to sustain day out, day in a lot of exercise. So carbohydrates are going to help you increase your fitness, whereas a low carbohydrate diet will increase fat oxidation rates, but that in the long term is not going to get you any faster.
And execution of those sessions as well are going to be important from an intensity perspective as well.
Yeah, pushing 250 watts or 350 watts during intervals will have a massive difference on the adaptive response to exercise, even though you might be oxidizing more fat during pushing 250 watts. It's the total amount of work you do that matters.
But so flip that onto the other side, and what we're seeing now, we're seeing a generation where we've gone through a low carbohydrate period, and now we're starting to see this higher carbohydrate period. But what we're seeing in, certainly some of the athletes now, we're seeing upwards of 120, 140, even 200 grams an hour we've seen recently. Why are people doing that? Is that valid?
Well, there is not a lot of evidence out there that shows that 120 grams per hour or even higher would aid performance, because we test a lot in the lab, actually, let's say, absorption rates or utilization rates of ingested carbohydrates, and we rarely see anyone to be able to oxidize more than, let's say, 90 grams an hour when you have a composite of glucose and fructose. There are people that can oxidize more. So we did a study a few years ago looking at 90 versus 120 grams per hour. And yes, people were able to oxidize more of the ingested carbohydrates when they went to 120. But did that result in any meaningful difference in using glycogen in the body? No. there was no difference whatsoever. It actually decreased use of fat. So basically you had fat sparing when going super high with carbohydrates. Is that going to improve performance? Likely not. But so don't really see where these kind of super high amounts are coming from, especially in amateur athletes where the power output is not as high. So not everyone is like today Pogacar pushing 450 watts for 20 minutes or an hour. Most people will be hovering around 300 watts if they are well trained, and they would definitely not benefit from going above 90 grams per hour because there is simply no requirement for such high amounts of carbohydrates.
So for recreational athletes, amateur, even high-level amateur athletes, what should we be taking? How many grams of carbohydrates, or how many grams per hour of carbohydrates should we be taking, or is this really dependent on the context of what you're doing?
I think it depends on the context what you're doing. But I think like you need to be consistently fueling the session. It's not be like, oh, there is a race coming up, so I will fuel a lot. You just need to consistently, every single training session you do, think about what the goal of the session is, and then decide on the fueling strategy. And then, figure out what kind of works, what doesn't work, but be consistent, because that way your body gets used to the carbohydrates, knows how to deal with them in terms of gut comfort, and also the patience and the basically recovery will be best that way. But you see that it can be anything from 45 grams per hour up to 90 grams per hour, or even sometimes without carbohydrates if you do a really short training session, for instance.
And I think that comes down to the principles of training, and the consistency of training there is one of the biggest factors in terms of increasing your fitness. And what you've said there, and correct me if it's different, is actually the consistency of your nutrition to be able to execute those day after day, week after week, month out of month, without accumulating too much fatigue or not being able to execute some of the harder sessions, is going to give you the biggest benefit to your fitness.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you think about it, what you do with nutrition is and training, you basically train day in, day out to basically compete on one single event. So for amateurs, it might be a Gran Fondo. So you're trying to get better and recover from each training sessions, get the most benefits out of it. So it really depends on what you do day in, day out. So once you do one session, you already during it, you're thinking, what is the next one going to be? How do I recover best for the next one? It's not that you do a Sunday ride and that's it, now I'm free for a week. It doesn't happen. So you always need to kind of think one step ahead. And this is kind of where this concept of carbohydrate or nutritional periodization is coming from, where you're okay, you don't take one single session and think about the fueling for it. You think about how to optimize the nutrition for the week or for the month or for the training block, and how you can support with nutrition the training block to get the most out of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose finally on this bit, we are seeing, especially in the professional side, even in other endurance sports like triathlon and running, we're seeing we're seeing increases in power output, in speeds, in performances. And some riders, are saying that nutrition is kind of the new or the replacement for doping. Do we think that these performance advantages or gains that we are seeing now count to the advancements that we're seeing in nutrition application?
Yeah, very likely, because in the past probably everything was about let's be honest, about doping, and how do we how do people trick the system. These days riders are counting every gram of pasta they have, so that they can actually optimize the energy availability for the recovery and be able to compete the next day. So there are kind of two kind of things that come to my mind. So first one is basically the training quality is increased these days because the riders are paying more attention in the training camps, for instance, to be able to perform on the next training session. So by recovering better, they can push higher watts in the trainings and they can go for longer. And that brings the training volume up, which brings the training adaptations up. And then in the races, in a fresh state, when it comes to a time trial, I don't think nutrition has a big role, but when it comes to basically be able to recover day to day and be able to push higher watts towards the end of a stage, so fatigue resistance, I think nutrition has a really important role.
Cool. And outside of your academic research and the work you've done with athletes and professional cycling, you've also played an integral part in the evolution of endurance products. What makes that different to other products that we see out there?
So I think, to be just clear, like, it's no bullshit. Everything is very simple and like science based. So like it comes from my kind of understanding of the science, and it's like when we started like years ago, I got really frustrated when I was looking at the products from the competition, and we were like, well, there is not a lot of like up-to-date formulations with what science was saying. There was a lot of like bullshit claims, but actually it was not about what actually the science or the core, the simple principles are saying. So with endurance, like we try to rectify that and like improve on that. So what we currently have in the product line, we just like really strongly believe that this is what science is saying. There are no false claims. There are no like ingredients that supposedly do something. It's just like what really the science has shown that is the best. And if it's not science proven, we don't have it in the product line.
And I think that's really important in a world that we live in, social media and all the marketing that goes around it is a very difficult world to navigate. However, actually getting the fundamentals and everything else right is going to give you the biggest advancements, rather than some special ingredient that hasn't really been tested from a scientific perspective.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you want to be. Nutrition is a simple thing. It's basically about carbohydrates. It's about energy. Like you need to fill up the tank, like in the car, and that matters the most. And if you don't do that, like you can't perform. So if you start focusing on things that don't really matter as much, you very often lose the focus of what is the most important. And even when I work with professional athletes, I think it's all about getting the basics right. Only second to this, we start thinking about the marginal gains. It's about substantial gains because that's what brings the performance up. And with elite athletes, like we kind of moved away, I feel, from thinking about supplements. We're just trying to make the basics right, getting the amount of carbohydrates right. Athletes are eating normal food. It's not about, special formulations anymore. They're eating pasta, they're eating rice, they're eating potatoes. And on the bike, they have carbohydrate gels that contain only carbohydrates, no, bullshit vitamins and stuff like that.
And your role in academia as well has lent yourself to spend a lot of time in the lab, testing athletes, testing different formulations and things like that. How has that played a role in certainly what you prescribe, the formulations you suggest, and how that translates into the real world application?
Well, the interesting thing about science is that when we publish a study, we always look at the averages, so the population average. So we get 15 people to test, and then at the end we compare the average of 15 with the average of 15 with a different intervention, and that's it. That's the answer. But like when you work with professional athletes, each individual is a bit different, so you want to adapt that. Body size, power output, everything is changing. So like I always try to think that like science is great, but sometimes you want to make some individual kind of modifications. But when it comes to designing the product, you want to cater for as many different people as possible, and try to evolve the product over time to basically be able to reach as many people as possible. So that's when you start playing with electrolytes in the product. That's when you start making smaller boluses of carbohydrates and try to like reach as many people as possible. And for instance, like one of the things you never do in research is like play with the flavors, because we just give unflavored products. But then flavor fatigue, for instance, working with athletes, like after 3 weeks or 2 weeks of eating the same 3 flavors, that become a big problem. So you want to like have more of the flavors in the product line, something that science on its own will never think about, but then when you work with athletes, this is something that becomes really important.
Yeah, it's interesting on how there's subtle things like flavor can play a role as well, because I've used sports nutrition products over the years, and I've drifted towards the natural flavor, especially for longer things, because it's just easier to palate. But then I know people who like flavors like raspberry ripple and things like that, and I kind of think, after 5 hours, are you going to enjoy that flavor anymore? So like you mentioned there, it's important that there's some of that is taken into consideration as well. So I want to just deep dive into a couple of topics that I think are probably most prominent in sports nutrition at the moment. And as I mentioned before, we've kind of been through this kind of low carbohydrate, fasted phase. We've gone through higher carbohydrate. What we're seeing now, certainly amongst professionals and high-performing amateurs, is carbohydrate periodization. And I suppose, first of all, do we just want to explain to the listeners what carbohydrate periodization is and how that is helpful and why it is working for people in modern endurance sports?
So basically, carbohydrate or nutritional periodization come from the fact that like let's say normal person would have the same diet day in, day out, because they would go to work, have the same breakfast, have a similar lunch, similar dinner. But when it comes to athletes, today you have an endurance ride, 4 hours low intensity, the next day you have 3 hours of intervals. And the nutritional demands for both training sessions are completely different or very different. And then you also have a rest day. So what nutritional periodization is that you adapt your nutrition to basically support the needs of the upcoming training session to get most out of it. So before a high intensity training session means more carbohydrates before, and you don't just wake up in the morning, now I have a intense session, what do I do? You start thinking already the day before what's coming up next. And that's kind of the nutritional periodization, about thinking and adapting the nutrition to the training program.
And I know I've not coined this term, but there's a lot of talk about fueling for the work required. And I guess that's the general principle behind it, is, if we've got a lot of work to do, we need to fuel more. And if we have a little bit less, we don't need to fuel quite the same for that. And across the kind of macronutrients, the carbohydrates, the proteins, the fats, do we kind of just focus on the carbohydrates as the thing that changes? Do we keep protein and fats constant throughout? What's your view on that?
Well, if you look at the recommendations, like in general, sometimes you see them as percentage. So certain percentage carbohydrates and certain percentage fats and then protein. I like to look at the grams per kilo and kind of clump fat and protein to be very similar along most days. And then just vary the carbohydrate intake. So I'm kind of a fan of a low-fat diet, especially for athletes, because I want to prioritize the ingestion of carbohydrates to promote the recovery. So it's basically like always ask the question, what's the next training session about? What you want to achieve? What it requires to get it through? And then you plan the carbohydrate intake accordingly.
And why do we think that is working? Why is that approach that we've got now? Is it around weight management? Is it around optimizing training stimulus? Where has that approach come from?
I think it kind of optimizes the recovery and also performance in training, which then relates to the training stimulus. And by periodizing the nutritional intake, you make sure that you have also days when the energy availability is a bit lower. So it also helps with maintaining or getting your body composition right. Because it would be a bit stupid to, for instance, be in energy deficit before an interval training session when it's all about pushing high power output. Equally, you can be in energy deficit when you're doing low intensity stuff, because low intensity doesn't require as much kind of contribution from carbohydrates. So all these kind of things, I think, in the end leads to better performance over time.
And I guess we don't want all that energy available when we're sat on the sofa watching TV as
exactly.
well. So another hot topic as well, which this has been, so kind of coming away from the carbohydrates and looking at ergogenic aids. This has been around for a long time. It's had peaks and troughs in terms of its popularity, but recently it has returned and has got quite a lot of gravity. But that's sodium bicarbonate. And it kind of seems to be used in lots of different ways. Originally, it was just for high intensity. We're kind of using it in lots of different ways now. Is there some validation around that hype? Has the new research come out that's made it more popular? And how does it work?
Oh yeah, so sodium bicarbonate is probably almost as well researched, I would say, than as carbohydrates to improve performance. Like, it's one of those supplements that has been known for ages that it actually works. The problem is that if you take sodium bicarbonate and you buy it in a grocery shop and you put it with a scoop into the glass of water, the taste is horrible. And it's very likely that you will end up on a toilet a few minutes later.
I've been there. I don't know if you tried it.
Yeah. I still can't even think about how bad it tastes. But yeah, so it causes GI issues, tastes horribly, but it actually does the thing. So it does improve performance and also potential training adaptations. So scientists have came with a solution a few years ago, basically encapsulating the capsules with bicarbonate into the capsules. So first you prevent the problem with the flavor, but if you use the right capsules, you can also minimize the risk of GI issues. Because what it does, sodium bicarbonate, is basically reduces the acidity of the blood. The problem is, so it basically reacts with the acid. The problem is that when you eat the bicarbonate, it first goes into the stomach, and the stomach is very, very acidic. And there is a chemical reaction that's going to happen in there unless you stop it, and that basically causes GI issues. So if you basically are able to bypass the stomach and only get the bicarbonate released in the small intestine when it gets absorbed, you can minimize the risk of GI issues. So using certain capsules, you can basically make sure that doesn't happen and minimize the risk of GI issues. So you basically prevent the problem with the flavor, and then you prevent or minimize the risk of the GI issues.
Yeah, and I mean, there's even stories about, before this kind of came to light and the administration of it, the stories of, like, there's a famous story of Michael Woods eating it from a spoon, before a race, which if anyone has tried it, that would be very hard to do. But it's nice that has evolved and come back. So when would be, for the listeners here, when would be the best time to be using this, and when would we kind of want to avoid that?
Well, it works when you're doing some high intensity exercise sessions, when basically there will be an acid buildup in the blood. So before interval training sessions, that would make sense. It will also make sense before very intense races to have sodium bicarb to help improve that.
So do we see anything for kind of the moderate to low intensity effort, sessions or races nowadays?
Not really. Like, there is some potential benefit from the hydration perspective because of a lot of sodium that you would have in hours before the exercise. Increasing the amount of water in the body in the heat might help. which some people are seeing, and there is research ongoing on that topic. But from the functional perspective, I don't think that would be a lot of. It's all about high intensity efforts, and it's also high intensity efforts towards the end of the races. So we see professional athletes in the classics using sodium bicarbonate, so before and then topping up during exercise with a buffer drink to basically maintain the bicarbonate in the blood.
Okay, so if I've never used it before, what is the best approach? How would I go about using it? Kind of what dose, what kind of session or event would I think about whether I would use it for the first time in an event? That might be a bit dangerous, but how would I go about starting to use that, or certainly starting to think about using it?
I think a good thing would be to start before a training session, an intense training session. Start with a dose of 0.2 grams per kilo and have it 2 to 3 hours before the training session to see how the body reacts. Drink plenty of water alongside it, and then just do the training session and see what happens. And then over time progress to 0.3 grams per kilo, and you can have it 2 hours usually before the session. The longer the session, the more closer to the session you can take it, so that you have the benefits for longer. And then if it's a cycling race or a really long training session, you can also benefit with having a buffer drink during, so to top up, because the bicarbonate will get excreted over time.
Okay. So I just want to finally, before we wrap this up and take any questions that anyone wants to ask, I just want to go on to a couple of topics which are more generalist approaches from nutrition, certainly for recreational amateur athletes out there. But let's say I was kind of doing six to 10 hours a week of training, and I've got a job, family, etc. What's the biggest nutritional win or change that I could make that's going to impact my performance?
I would say always think what training sessions you're doing next and what the demands of it are. So let's say that you're training very early in the mornings, because that's before work, and you have an interval training session. It's not the end of the world if you don't have time for breakfast, for instance. Just make sure that the dinner, for instance, the day before is substantial in carbohydrates, and that you fuel during the session really well in the morning. So just think what the session is, and if the session is intense, you need more carbohydrates before and also during. I think that's kind of the most important message for people, to periodize the nutrition.
And I suppose you might have already answered this, but what are the common mistakes that we start to see?
Yeah, it's basically not doing that and going for a Sunday ride, thinking, well, I need to lose weight, so I'm not going to eat a lot the day before, but then you come home and you basically realize you're completely destroyed. So you open the fridge and then continue eating for the next 3 days because you just don't recover, and you did nothing basically. The session was not as effective as it could have been. The recovery was really poor, and you're not in energy deficit. You might actually be in an energy surplus.
Okay, so fueling the sessions and really going to fueling the work that we're going to be doing in the future and currently is probably going to be the most effective long term.
Yeah, because if you think about a single session on a Sunday, a long ride, if you fuel before and get prepared for that session, after it you will not feel as hungry because you did not exhaust all the reserves in the body, and that will aid with the recovery, and it will also aid with hunger, because the next day might be just an easy day. So you might not actually need carbohydrates after exercise, you need them especially before.
Cool, thank you. Well, we're going to finish up there. We hope that there's been some interesting insights for you.